In the fall of 1943, Japan's Imperial General Headquarters issued a document that they believed would decide the Pacific War. It mapped out a chain of islands, the Marianas, the Carolines, Western New Guinea, the Bonins, and declared that anyone who crossed that line was crossing into Japan itself. They called it the Absolute National Defense Sphere. They poured concrete into it, tunneled under it, ran telephone cable through it, and pointed every strategy they had toward holding it. The men who drafted it considered it not a defensive line, but a guarantee. By July 1944, 9 months later, that entire defensive perimeter was gone. Not because Americans had bled their way through it island by island, not because Japanese soldiers had failed to fight, because Americans had simply gone around most of it, and the islands that didn't get taken got left behind, and the men on them stayed there, watching the war move somewhere else until there was nothing to do but wait, and grow sweet potatoes in coral soil, and count the days until somebody came to tell them it was over. Here is the number that should settle the question of whether this strategy worked before you hear another word. Between February 1 and the 15th of June, 1944, and 4.5 months, American forces covered roughly 1,000 miles across the Central Pacific, not by assaulting every fortified Japanese position in their path, by jumping over most of them. Somewhere between 300,000 and 350,000 Japanese soldiers were left behind in that wake, sitting on islands the war had already passed, eating whatever they could grow, waiting for a battle that had moved on without them. On the 9th of July, 1944, the day Saipan was declared secure, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo walked into the Imperial Palace and tendered his resignation. Saipan was supposed to be the turning point for Japan. It had been built into their planning as the island that would bleed American forces so badly they'd negotiate. Instead, it fell in 25 days. An army officer named Eiichiro Osawa, serving with the Kwantung Army in Manchuria, heard the news over a radio broadcast and later told American interrogators precisely what he thought. When we heard about Saipan, we knew it was all over. What this video is about is why Japanese commanders didn't see it coming, what their own documents say about how they understood or failed to understand what was being done to them, and what happened to the hundreds of thousands of soldiers on islands the war decided weren't worth fighting over. The argument that produced the island-hopping strategy was a fight between two of the most outsized personalities in American military history, and understanding it requires understanding those men separately before you can understand what they built together. Douglas MacArthur turned 62 inches 1,942. His career stretched back to the Spanish-American War. He had served in the Philippines, been Army Chief of Staff, returned to the Philippines to train their nascent military, and been there when Japan's bombs fell. He escaped Corregidor by PT boat on the 11th of March 1942, under direct presidential orders, leaving behind 76,000 American and Filipino troops who would spend 3.5 years in Japanese prison camps, dying at a rate that had no parallel in the American experience of the war. At a railway station in Tarawa, South Australia, on March 20, 9 days after his escape, MacArthur told reporters the 4 words that would dictate strategy for 2.5 more years: "I shall return." That promise was not theater. It was a bone-deep commitment that shaped every decision he made about how and where to fight. And it was a commitment that Japanese commanders came to understand, because it meant the Philippines would be a target they could plan around. Admiral Ernest J. King was the Chief of Naval Operations in Washington, a man his own daughter described with a clarity that tells you everything you need to know about working with him. "My father is the most even-tempered man in the world. He's always angry." King believed the Pacific was a naval war, and would be decided by naval power. His plan called for a direct drive through the Central Pacific, the Marshalls, the Carolines, the Marianas, that would sever Japan's supply lines to the resource areas of the South and force the combined fleet into a decisive engagement on American terms. He had no patience for MacArthur's insistence on the Philippines as a moral and strategic obligation, and MacArthur had no patience for King's dismissal of the Southwest Pacific as a secondary theater. The Joint Chiefs' solution to these two irreconcilable personalities was a compromise that, accidentally, became brilliant strategy. Two simultaneous axes of advance. MacArthur pushing northwest along New Guinea's coast, while King's Navy drove through the Central Pacific, neither man reporting to the other. Their common boss was the President of the United States, who was fighting a war in Europe simultaneously and could not give either theater his full attention. For Japanese intelligence officers trying to identify the main American thrust and concentrate defenses accordingly, this command arrangement was quietly maddening. There was no main thrust, there were two, and they were coordinated to stretch Japanese reserves across multiple directions simultaneously, ensuring that reinforcements sent to one axis arrived too late to matter at the other. The rivalry between these two axes reached its sharpest moment at a private residence overlooking Waikiki Beach on July 26 to 27, 1944. President Roosevelt, freshly nominated for a fourth term, met with MacArthur and Nimitz to make the decision that would shape the Pacific War's final year. Would the main American push go through the Philippines or bypass them entirely for Formosa, cutting Japan's supply lines from a position closer to the home islands? MacArthur arrived by open limousine with a motorcycle escort theatrical in exactly the way that made Navy officers quietly seethe, and kept Roosevelt and Nimitz waiting on the lanai. When a large wall map was spread on a table and Roosevelt pointed to it and asked, "Well, Doug, where do we go from here?" MacArthur's answer was immediate: Leyte, Mr. President, and then Luzon. What followed, according to the memorandum Nimitz sent afterward to Admiral King, was MacArthur, in full rhetorical force, the Philippines as sacred obligation, the 17 million Filipinos who had been promised liberation, American blood on American souls, if those islands were abandoned. It was not primarily a strategic argument. It was a moral one, pressed with the conviction of a man who had staked his professional identity on a four-word promise made at an Australian railway station in 1942. Roosevelt did not announce a decision at the meeting. On the 9th of August, 1944, he wrote MacArthur, confirming the Philippines route. The formal JCS endorsement came October 3. On October 20, MacArthur waded ashore at Leyte, in knee-deep surf, and broadcast over Army radio, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." Whether bypassing the Philippines for Formosa would have been faster or cheaper is one of the genuinely unresolvable questions of the Pacific War. What matters for this story is that even at its most mature, the island-hopping concept was being contested, modified, and argued over by the men executing it. It was not a clean intellectual program handed from planners to commanders. It was improvised, fought over, and revised in real time against an enemy that was also revising, slowly and too late, its understanding of what was being done to it. Admiral William Halsey, whose nickname was a reporter's accident, a typo that changed Bill to Bull, and stuck, despite his vocal objections for the rest of his life, gave the strategic logic its most direct formulation. He said, "Jump over the enemy's strong points, blockade them, and leave them to starve." 7 words, the entire strategy in a single sentence. The first time that principle was applied as deliberate strategy, not just tactical opportunism, was July 1943. In the Solomon Islands, And the decision happened fast enough that historians have sometimes missed how conscious it was. Kolombangara was next in line. After the grinding New Georgia campaign, 3 months of jungle fighting for an island with one usable airfield, Halsey's staff was looking at the charts and hating what they saw. Kolombangara had approximately 10,000 to 12,000 Japanese troops under Major General Minoru Sasaki, dug in and waiting, having watched what happened on New Georgia and prepared their defenses accordingly. Assaulting Kolombangara would look like New Georgia weeks of casualties in thick jungle against a prepared enemy who had nowhere to go and no reason to quit. A staff officer presented Halsey with an alternative. Vella La Vella, the island northwest of Kolombangara, had only about 250 Japanese. It had a usable airstrip site. It was further up the Solomon's chain. Assaulting it directly would put American forces past Kolombangara, cutting Sasaki's supply lines without fighting his prepared defenses at all. Halsey later described his own uncertainty. The undue length of the Munda operation and our casualties made me wary of another slugging match, but I didn't know how to avoid it. His staff showed him how. American forces landed on Vella La Vella on the 15th of August, 1943. Kolombangara's 12,000-man garrison, watching their supply ships stop arriving, watching American airfields go up on the island to their northwest, was evacuated by small boats and torpedo craft between September 28 and October 4. They went to Bougainville. They fought Australians there through 1,945. They were not eliminated, they were moved. But the airfield Halsey needed was built without the casualties Sasaki had been prepared to inflict. What made that sentence executable in 1943 and 1944, where it would have been impossible in 1942, was a pair of advantages that had been building since the war began: signals intelligence and air power. ULTRA, the broken Japanese military codes, told American commanders what was on every island before they decided whether to take it. Air supremacy, achieved island by island through attritional fighter combat and carrier strikes, meant that Japanese garrisons bypassed by the advance could be kept suppressed with periodic bombing and denied the ability to interfere with American flanks. Without Ultra, you could not know which islands were heavily garrisoned and which were soft targets. Without air dominance, bypassed garrisons could strike at your supply lines. The strategy required both preconditions, and by 1943, both existed. Japan's strategic problem in the Pacific ran deep-rooted in a doctrine called Kantai Kessen, decisive battle, that had been refined across 2 decades of planning and was by 1941 essentially the only strategic framework the Imperial Japanese Navy knew how to think inside. The concept rested on one foundational assumption: that America, with its enormous industrial capacity and its citizens' relative comfort with peacetime life, would not sustain the casualties of a prolonged Pacific War. Japan could not match American production in a war of attrition. Japan could not, across a 10-year horizon, build more ships and aircraft than the United States. What Japan could do was impose such a catastrophic cost on American forces early enough in the war that the American public would choose negotiation over continued fighting. The decisive battle doctrine was designed to deliver that cost. Japan would trade space for time, allowing American forces to advance, bleeding them with submarines and land-based air, weakening them with night surface engagements until the moment was right for the combined fleet's main body to strike. That engagement, fought in the Western Pacific near Japanese bases and far from American repair facilities, would shatter American naval power sufficiently that Washington would deal. Every Japanese war game before Pearl Harbor built from this premise, and every one of those war games assumed that America would advance sequentially, island by island, atoll by atoll, The Japanese had built their empire in a specific geographic sequence during 1941 and 1942, sweeping south and east through the Solomons, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Carolines, the Philippines. They assumed the Americans would retrace that path in reverse, fighting for each island in the order Japan had taken it. And every defensive plan Japan made rested on that assumption. Commander Nakajima Chikataka, a senior naval planner, captured this assumption precisely in his interrogation by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey. On the 21st of October 1945, the most direct documentary evidence of what Japanese naval planners had actually expected. Opinion in the Japanese Navy had it that you were advancing exactly in the track of the Japanese occupation scheme at the beginning of the war. The first large-scale application of the bypass concept was Rabaul, and the decision to bypass it was made not on any Pacific beach, but in a conference room in Quebec in August 1943. Rabaul sat at the northeastern tip of New Britain, the largest island in the Bismarck archipelago. Its harbor could shelter the entire combined fleet. Its 5 airfields hosted hundreds of aircraft. Since 1942, it had been the command center for Japan's entire South Pacific operation, the base from which every attempt to hold Guadalcanal had been directed, the hub through which troops and supplies flowed into every campaign further east. By 1943, it held approximately 110,000 troops, the 8th Area Army under General Hitoshi Imamura, and the Southeast Area Fleet under Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka. MacArthur's February 1943 planning document, the Elkton III Plan, called for taking Rabaul directly in a staged 7-step advance. The one problem: it required 7 more divisions than existed in the theater. The combined chiefs of staff, meeting at Quebec in August 1943, made the decision that altered the war's geometry. Rabaul would not be assaulted. It would be surrounded and isolated. The 110,000-man garrison left inside a shrinking ring of Allied air bases until the island's military value was 0. The troops still there, but unable to do anything about anything. MacArthur initially objected, but eventually came around. The encirclement proceeded through the fall and winter of 1943. Cape Gloucester on December 26, the Green Islands on the 15th of February 1944, the Admiralty Islands on February 29. The ring closed on the 20th of March 1944, with the capture of Emerau Island, a tiny speck of land that completed the geometry. No significant Japanese force could reach Rabaul from any direction without crossing airspace controlled by Allied fighters. By that point, Rabaul's airfields had already stopped mattering. The last major air reinforcement Japan sent to Rabaul, carrier aircraft from the fleet, committed to stop the Allied advance in the Solomons in November 1943, had been destroyed at such a rate that they were never replaced. The island's 5 airfields became targets rather than threats. Allied bomber crews called missions over Rabaul, milk runs. At some point in 1944, Rabaul's airspace was being used as live-fire training for new pilots who needed experience against real anti-aircraft guns before being sent somewhere that actually mattered. 110,000 Japanese soldiers had become a training exercise. General Hitoshi Imamura, commanding those 110,000 men, understood by early 1944 that Americans were not coming. What he did next reveals something that gets lost in the larger strategic picture: the human dimension of what bypass warfare actually meant for the people it bypassed. Imamura was 57 years old, fluent in English, and known throughout the Japanese army as an officer who treated prisoners according to the laws of war. He had court-martialed his own officers for prisoner abuse in the Netherlands East Indies. an act of moral clarity that was rare in any army in that war. Now he had 110,000 men on an island the Pacific had moved past. He ordered the garrison to feed itself. Soldiers cleared jungle and planted sweet potatoes, taro, beans, and vegetables on whatever soil the coral and volcanic rock could support. They dug wells. They converted tunnels built for defense into workshops, storage rooms, and in some cases operating theaters. When Allied bombing reduced in frequency because there was nothing left worth destroying, the engineering work expanded. Men who had trained as tank crews learned to operate stills for distilling fresh water. Men who had trained as radio operators learned field medicine. Tokyo Radio, in a broadcast that was either propaganda or dark comedy, depending on your vantage point, described the Rabaul garrison as absolutely free from mortal desires. Everyone is at once a scientist, a farmer, and a sage. What Tokyo Radio did not broadcast, an estimated 95% of the garrison contracted malaria at least once. In a single month in 1944, medical records showed 30,000 malarial relapses across the island. Soldiers who could not get quinine because the supply ships had stopped coming used every traditional remedy anyone could remember and improvised the rest. The food grown on cleared jungle plots kept men alive, but left them running on reduced calories for months at a time. Physical strength degraded to the point where work that would have taken a fit soldier an hour took 2. On the 6th of September, 1945, approximately 69,000 Japanese troops and 20,000 civilians surrendered aboard the British carrier HMS Glory in Rabaul Harbor. Imamura came aboard in his dress uniform, pressed, correct, formal, and surrendered his command with the same precision he had maintained through 4 years of war. He later voluntarily served his war crimes sentence in the same prison as his enlisted men, a gesture so unusual in any army's senior command that Australian prison officials didn't quite know what to make of it. The 8th Area Army that surrendered at Rabaul had not fought a significant engagement since 1943. They had been a garrison, then a farm, then a formality. The formal structure of Japan's absolute national defense sphere was adopted on the 30th of September 1943 at an imperial conference with Emperor Hirohito present. The perimeter ran from the Kuril Islands in the north through the Bonins, the Marianas, the Carolines including Truk, through western New Guinea, and down through the Netherlands East Indies. Inside that line was everything Japan required to continue fighting oil from Borneo and Sumatra, rubber from Malaya, tin, bauxite, rice. Outside it was everything Japan had taken and was now prepared to sacrifice in defense of the inner core. The ANZ plan assumed Japan had time to fortify the perimeter adequately before Americans reached it. Japanese planners needed to rebuild carrier air strength, the planes and trained pilots that had been attrited in fighting from midway through the Solomons to a level sufficient to fight the decisive battle when it came. They calculated a need for 55,000 aircraft by 1944. Their factories were producing approximately 1,400 per month. The math was impossible, and by the time the ANZ was formally adopted, everyone who looked at it honestly knew the math was impossible. Admiral Mineichi Koga, who had taken command of the combined fleet after Admiral Yamamoto was shot down over Bougainville on April 18, 1943, was the man responsible for defending a perimeter. He didn't have the aircraft to defend. His response to constant requests for air reinforcement from Rabaul was to conserve his carrier planes for the decisive battle. When he finally committed those carrier aircraft to Rabaul in November 1943, they were lost at a rate that the Japanese training pipeline could not begin to replace. The decisive battle Japan was preserving its strength to fight could not now be fought because the strength was gone. Post-war Japanese naval testimony recorded that Koga frequently expressed something close to envy for Yamamoto for dying when he did, with victories still on his record, before the full shape of the disaster became visible. Koga himself died on the 31st of March 1944, when his flying boat went down in a typhoon between Palau and Davao. He was replaced by Admiral Soemu Toyoda. The operational plan Koga had been carrying, the Z-Plan, Japan's blueprint for fighting the decisive battle, was captured by Filipino guerrillas and relayed to American intelligence. It had been transmitted in plain text rather than code, an error that handed American planners precise foreknowledge of exactly how Japan intended to fight the battle that was coming. What happened at Kwajalein on the 1st of February 1944 is the single clearest illustration of what Japanese strategic expectations looked like, colliding with American strategic reality. The Marshall Islands were not one target. They were dozens of atolls: Jaluit, Maloelap, Voce, Mili, Kwajalein, Eniwetok, stretching across 800 miles of ocean. Japan had held them under a League of Nations mandate since 1920 and had spent 3 years fortifying them. The outer atolls, Jaluit, Voce, Maloelap, Mili, had received the most attention. They had airfields, gun emplacements, prepared defensive positions. Kwajalein, at the geographic center of the atoll chain, had lighter defenses. Commander Nakajima's USSBS interrogation recorded what Japanese planners had actually expected. There was divided opinion as to whether you would land at Jaluit or Mil. Some thought you would land on Voce, but there were few who thought you would go right to the heart of the Marshalls and take Kwajalein. The Japanese had reinforced the wrong islands. Nimitz's decision to strike Kwajalein directly skipping the fortified outer atolls entirely was opposed by every senior officer under him. Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance, who would command the operation, called it dangerous. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding the amphibious forces, agreed with Spruance. Major General Holland Smith, whose divisions would make the landings, argued the risks were unacceptable without first neutralizing the outer atoll's airfields. All three preferred a sequential approach: take the outer atolls, build airfields, then move on Kwajalein from a secure foundation. Nimitz overruled all three of them. He made his position unmistakable. If they wouldn't execute the plan, he would find commanders who would. Ultra-intelligence had given him the exact garrison strengths across the Marshalls. He knew the outer atolls were the reinforced ones. He knew Kwajalein was the softer center, and he struck it. The 4th Marine Division, barely formed, never before in combat, landed on Roy and Namur at the northern end of the atoll on February 1. The 7th Infantry Division struck Kwajalein Island itself. Of the 3,500-man Japanese garrison on Roy Namur, 51 were alive when American troops declared the islands secure. Kwajalein Island fell in 4 days. The 4 outer atolls, Voce, Maloelap, Mili, Jaluit, with a combined garrison of 13,700 men, were bypassed. Periodic bombing continued for the remainder of the war. When those garrisons surrendered in September 1945, 4,876 men were dead, not from combat, but from disease and starvation. American bombing had killed 2,564. The decision not to fight for those islands had killed nearly twice that number through deprivation. And Nimitz, reading the results from Kwajalein, did something his own planners had not anticipated even from him. The assault on Eniwetok, originally scheduled for the 1st of May 1944, was moved up to February 17, 2.5 months early, before the dust at Kwajalein had settled. Eniwetok and Truk fell in the same 2 days, February 17 to 18, 1,944. And the coincidence was not accidental. Task Force 58, under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, hit Truk while Eniwetak's landings went in simultaneously 670 miles to the east. The coordination was a statement of logistical capacity that Japanese planners had not believed possible. America running two major operations simultaneously across 670 miles of open ocean with no meaningful degradation in either effort. Truk's reputation had preceded it. The Japanese called it the Gibraltar of the Pacific. American sailors called it the Japanese Pearl Harbor. The reality, when American reconnaissance aircraft finally got good photographs of the atoll in late 1943, was considerably less impressive than either description. Roughly 40 anti-aircraft guns without adequate fire control radar, no major shore batteries, and runways that could not accommodate the number of aircraft Japanese propaganda implied were there. The lagoon was magnificent, 200 square miles of protected deep water, but the fixed defenses were thin. Japan's admirals knew this too, which is why the combined fleet's major warships had been moving out of Truk since October 1943, accelerating sharply in early February 1944, when Japanese reconnaissance aircraft spotted Mitcher's task force approaching. The battleships, carriers, and heavy cruisers were already gone when 560 American aircraft arrived on February 17. What filled the harbor was tankers, merchant ships, and auxiliaries, and the enormous fuel depot that was Truk's true strategic value. Operation Hailstone sank 32 merchant ships, 2 light cruisers, 4 destroyers, and 4 fleet tankers. Approximately 250 aircraft were destroyed. Roughly 4,500 Japanese sailors and soldiers were killed. The tankers represented the loss that mattered most beyond the raw tonnage. 77,000 tons of fuel oil storage eliminated. The combined fleet had already fled, but now it had nowhere to refuel in the Central Pacific, even if it turned back. American losses over 2 days: 25 aircraft, 40 men killed, 1 carrier with a torpedo hit that made port under its own power. Nimitz decided formally to bypass Truk on the 12th of March, 1944. There was almost nothing left worth assaulting. The garrison that remained, approximately 7,500 Army troops and 4,000 Navy personnel, received exactly 7 supply submarines for the rest of the war against 11,500 men. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the officer who had commanded the Pearl Harbor strike force, was eventually assigned to command whatever remained of Truk's military function. He would later be transferred to Saipan, where he committed suicide as American Marines crossed the island in July 1944. MacArthur's move along the New Guinea coast in April 1944 had a different character than the Central Pacific jumps. It was theater-level deception, executed with a precision that the war's official historians struggled to fully credit until the ULTRA records were declassified. Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi commanded Japan's 18th Army at Wewak and Hansa Bay on New Guinea's north coast, somewhere between 50,000 and 55,000 troops, dug in and waiting. The logical, sequential American target was Hansa Bay. MacArthur's air forces had been hammering Wewak for months, reinforcing exactly that impression. Inflatable rubber dinghies beach reconnaissance equipment had been planted near Hansa Bay approaches, visible to Japanese aerial observers. Every indicator pointed at Hansa Bay. On the 22nd of April, 1944, American forces went ashore at Hollandia, 580 miles northwest of Wewak, deep in the rear of every Japanese position along the coast. The historian Edward Drea, whose examination of Ultra's role in MacArthur's campaigns was the definitive study of the subject, called Hollandia Ultra's single greatest contribution to MacArthur's Pacific strategy. Every wireless message between Adachi's headquarters and Tokyo was being read in near real time. MacArthur knew the exact strength at every point on the coast. He knew Hollandia had approximately 12,500 Japanese, of whom perhaps 500 were combat troops. He knew Adachi's main strength sat at Wewak, positioned to repel a landing that was not coming. Pre-invasion airstrikes caught 340 Japanese aircraft on the ground at Hollandia's 3 airfields and destroyed them before a single American soldier boarded a landing craft. American casualties at Hollandia: 152 killed, Japanese dead, approximately 3,300, with thousands more beginning the slow death from isolation that would consume the 18th Army over the next 16 months. Adachi's response to being cut off was, by any measure, the response of a determined commander facing an impossible situation. Imperial General Headquarters ordered him on May 2 to bypass Hollandia and march west, but Adachi refused. He wrote back in correspondence that was read by MacArthur before it reached Tokyo that such a march would destroy his army through exhaustion and disease before it reached anything worth fighting over. He was right, and he knew it. Instead, he launched a counterattack at Atape in July, where an American perimeter blocked the coast road. Between July 10 and the 25th of August, 1944, the Battle of the Driniumor River cost the 18th Army between 8,000 and 10,000 casualties for no change in the strategic situation. From a peak strength of approximately 140,000 Japanese troops across the New Guinea theater in 1943, the number alive to surrender in September 1945 was approximately 13,000. The rest had died, most not from battle wounds but from malnutrition, dysentery, and malaria, on an island the war had gone past before most of them even realized it was leaving. The Japanese General Staff produced a document during the war, a clinical internal analysis of how bypass warfare was affecting garrison troops. That is one of the most damning pieces of primary source evidence about what the poor strategy actually did to the men it left behind. It tracks garrison health degradation in stages. After 1.5 months of isolation from supply, malaria symptoms become widespread. After 2.5 months, a unit's military effectiveness is reduced by half. After 3.5 months, it is at 1/3. After 5 to 6 months, only 1 soldier in 7 can be considered physically fit. That document represents real people. Men who had trained, crossed an ocean, built fortifications, and then been overtaken by a strategy that had no interest in fighting them. They were not defeated in the field. They were simply made irrelevant, and then they began to die at the rate that irrelevance imposed. The Japanese official post-war accounting estimated that approximately 60% of all Japanese military personnel who died in the Pacific War died not from combat wounds, but from disease and starvation on bypassed islands, cut off from resupply after the war had moved on without them. The Asia-Pacific Journal's post-war study concluded directly. The main reason why there were so many deaths by starvation was the severing of Japanese supply lines. The situation was especially dire for the garrisons at the South Pacific Front, which had been left behind enemy lines due to the U.S. military's island-hopping strategy. That severing was not accidental. American submarines sank approximately 4.78 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping during the war. More than 54% of all Japanese vessel losses achieved by submarines that represented a small fraction of American naval strength. Japan's largest submarines, the ocean-going I-class boats theoretically capable of supplying isolated garrisons, were increasingly diverted from combat patrols to food-hauling missions, as the bypassing created more stranded garrisons than anyone had planned for. 7 submarines, in total, reached Truk's 11,500-man garrison for the last year of the war. The arithmetic of that fact is its own answer. By the spring of 1000, 944. Some Japanese planners who could look at the map without sentiment understood what was happening. Nakajima's USSBS testimony recorded the realization. We realized that you would not attempt to take very strong points such as Rabaul and Truk. Understanding the concept did not help predict which island was next. And that unpredictability was the strategy's sharpest edge. Japan could fortify every island on the perimeter. If it didn't know which one was coming, the fortifications were distributed across the entire chain, and no single point had enough strength to hold. The Marianas were the hinge. Japan's September 1943 ANS document had placed them explicitly inside the absolute defense sphere. The strategic logic was visible to any officer who looked at a map. From Saipan, a B-29 superfortress, the American bomber, that Japan's engineers were watching closely, and whose range they understood could reach Tokyo and return. The entire war, in Japan's strategic thinking, pivoted on keeping American air power away from the home islands. Saipan was where that pivot would be decided, and Admiral Toyota, who had inherited command of the combined fleet after Koga's death, declared as the Marianas invasion approached, "The fate of the empire rests on this one battle." He was not using rhetoric. He meant it as a factual statement, and he was correct. The American invasion fleet that arrived off Saipan on the 15th of June, 1944, was on a scale that Japanese defensive planning had been built around stopping 500 ships. More than 300,000 men involved in the broader Marianas operation. 3 divisions going ashore on Saipan, the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions on the beaches, the 27th Infantry Division following in reserve against 31,700 Japanese defenders under Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, who had been told to hold until the decisive naval battle made relief possible. Toyota sent the fleet. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa arrived with 9 carriers and 437 aircraft. Facing him was Mitcher's Task Force, 58, 15 carriers and 956 aircraft, supported by proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells, a technology Japan had no equivalent to, and, in June 1944, no knowledge of. Ozawa launched his aircraft in 4 waves on June 19, American F-6F Hellcat fighters, which outperformed the Zero at every altitude above 14,000 feet, met them in mass interceptions, guided by ship-based radar that vectored fighters precisely onto incoming formations. The proximity fused detonating shells not on contact, but when they passed within lethal distance of a target, turned Japanese attack formations into killing grounds. Across both days of the battle, Japan lost over 350 aircraft on June 19 alone. Carriers Taiho, Shokaku, and Hio were sunk by American submarines and aircraft. Ozawa retreated with 35 operational carrier aircraft from an original force of 437. A pilot over the battle exclaimed to his radio, "Hell, this is like an old-time turkey shoot, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot." It was the decisive battle Kantai Kessen had promised for 20 years. It happened, and it destroyed Japan's carrier aviation so completely that the carriers still afloat after the Philippine Sea were platforms without crews floating steel that could go to sea but could not fight. Saipan itself fell on the 9th of July, 1944, after 25 days of fighting that included, on the night of July 6 to 7, the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War. Approximately 3,500 Japanese soldiers, some carrying only sharpened bamboo, charged American lines before dawn. They penetrated several hundred yards, killing and wounding hundreds of Americans from the 27th Infantry Division before being stopped. Lieutenant General Saito had committed suicide the previous evening. Admiral Nagumo, commanding Saipan's naval garrison from a cave overlooking the sea, where he had launched the Pearl Harbor strike 3 years earlier, shot himself. 9 days after Saipan was declared secure, Prime Minister Tojo resigned. His entire cabinet went with him. The man who had presided over the decision to go to war, who had publicly promised his people that Americans would never take Saipan, walked out of office. Emperor Hirohito had already communicated that Tojo no longer held his confidence. The general who replaced him, Kuniaki Koiso, was widely considered less capable, a change made not to improve Japan's strategic position, but because Tojo's continued presence had become politically untenable. The first B-29 raid on Tokyo from Saipan's airfields launched on the 24th of November, 1944. 111 superfortresses flew over the city at 30,000 feet too high for most Japanese anti-aircraft guns to reach accurately, protected by altitude that their fighters struggled to reach quickly enough. Tokyo's residents saw them from the street, enormous silver aircraft in daylight formation, and understood what their presence meant in a way that official communiques could not disguise. These aircraft had flown from an island the government had promised would hold. Tinian, 8 miles south of Saipan, fell in the 8 days between July 24 and the 1st of August, 1944, in what Holland Smith called the most perfect amphibious operation of the Pacific War. The preliminary deception directed Japanese attention toward the obvious beaches on the island's southwest coast. The actual landings went in over 2 gaps in the northwest coral reef, each roughly 60 yards wide gaps that had been measured in the dark by underwater demolition teams who reported back that they were usable, barely. The Japanese commander had looked at those gaps on his planning maps and calculated they were too narrow for a major landing. He was wrong, and he did not have time to correct the error before the Marines were already inland. What Seabees built on Tinian's plateau afterward was, at the time of its completion, the largest airfield complex in the world. 6 runways at Northfield, each 8,500 feet long, built to handle 1,000 B-29s. 15,000 Seabees built it in months. From Northfield's runways, on August 6 and 9, 1,945 B-29s named Enola Gay and Boxcar carried atomic bombs to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The bypass of Wache and Malawialap, the encirclement of Rabaul, the jump to Hollandia, the strike at Kwajalein Center rather than its defended edges, every decision to go around rather than through had moved the calendar forward. Every month not spent reducing a bypassed stronghold was a month closer to Tinian's runways being operational. The strategy's final product was the shortest path to ending the war, arrived at by the longest conceptual argument in American military planning. In September 1944, American forces occupied Ulithi Atoll in the Western Carolines. The small Japanese garrison had been evacuated before they arrived. The atoll had one thing that made everything else possible: a 200 square mile lagoon, deep enough to anchor any warship afloat. Service Squadron 10, the logistics fleet that moved into Ulithi, numbered more than 400 vessels, repair ships, floating dry docks, large enough to lift a destroyer clear of the water, tankers, crane ships capable of handling turrets and gun mounts, ammunition barges, hospital ships, and floating barracks for repair crews who never went ashore anywhere but just lived aboard and worked. At peak capacity, 617 ships rode at anchor in Ulithi's lagoon simultaneously. A ship damaged in combat off the Philippines could reach Ulithi, be repaired by crews with full machine shop capacity, take on fuel, ammunition, and provisions, and return to the combat zone in approximately 1/3 the time the same process would have required at Pearl Harbor. Japanese war planners had built their attrition strategy. the progressive weakening of American forces during the long advance on the assumption that American supply lines across the Central Pacific would be the decisive vulnerability. Instead, the supply line moved with the fleet. The numbers that built all of this into possibility are worth sitting with for a moment because they frame everything else in this story. Pre-war analysis estimated that the United States possessed approximately 41.7% of global war-making potential against Japan's 3.5%. That 1:2-to-1 ratio in raw potential translated into 141 American carriers of all types against 17 Japanese, 349 American destroyers against 63 Japanese, 324,750 American aircraft produced during the war against 76,320 Japanese. In 1944 alone, American factories produced more aircraft than Japan, built from 1,939 through 1,945. Taken together, and none of these numbers stayed abstract. They showed up as aircraft over truck during what had become training raids. As landing craft off Kwajalein at a beach, the Japanese had expected to be defended by American reluctance to go to the center. As CB bulldozers on Tinian building runways in months rather than years. As the repair crews at Ulithi who never stopped working. Japan's one significant strategic response to the collapse of the absolute national defense sphere was to send 500,000 troops to the wrong place at the wrong time. Operation Ichigo, approved by Emperor Hirohito on the 24th of January, 1944, and launched in April, was the largest Japanese ground offensive of the entire Pacific War. 500,000 troops, 17 divisions, 800 tanks, 100,000 horses, more than 80% of the China Expeditionary Army's strength, committed to a massive drive through central China. The objectives were to neutralize American B-29 air bases near Chengdu and open an overland rail route to French Indochina, bypassing the sea lanes that American submarines were destroying. Ichigo achieved its stated objectives. The American airfields it targeted were captured, and the rail route was technically opened. But by the time both things happened, American B-29s had already moved to the Marianas, where there were no Japanese armies within 1,400 miles. The Chinese airfields Ichigo had overrun were empty. The rail route opened into a theater where it changed nothing. The 500,000 troops committed to China were not at Saipan in June 1944. Their tanks were not in the Marianas. Japan had spent an enormous portion of its remaining military strength on a campaign that solved a problem the Americans had already made irrelevant. Admiral Toyota, answering USSBS questioners about Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the battle where Japan committed its last remaining major fleet strength, framed the decision with a clarity that is almost unbearable in retrospect. If things went well, we might obtain unexpectedly good results, but if the worst should happen, there was a chance that we would lose the entire fleet. But I felt that chance had to be taken. All 4 of Japan's remaining fleet carriers were sunk at Cape Engano. 3 battleships went down in the Sibuyan Sea and Surigao Strait, and the combined fleet ceased to exist as an operational force in 4 days. The decisive battle had finally happened, and it had been just as decisive as Japan's doctrine had always insisted it would be, except it had destroyed Japan instead of saving it. Admiral Matome Ugaki, who had been Yamamoto's chief of staff on the aircraft that was shot down over Bougainville in April 1943, who had survived that attack, who spent the rest of the war watching the strategy he had helped design collapse, kept a diary. It was published after the war under the title Fading Victory. In it, he wrote a line that could serve as the strategy's epitaph from the Japanese side. I wonder why they don't give enough consideration to attacking enemy elements easy to destroy, instead of always seeking a decisive battle. He was writing about Japan's own leadership. The decisive battle the Kantai-Kessen Doctrine demanded had been sought at Midway, at the Philippine Sea, at Leyte Gulf. Each attempt had accelerated Japan's destruction rather than arrested it. The doctrine could not be abandoned, because it was not simply a strategic plan. It was, after 20 years of institutional cultivation, the framework through which Japanese naval officers understood war itself. You cannot improvise a new strategic logic in the middle of a war against a force that is already inside your perimeter. Island hopping had not defeated that logic in argument. It had made the argument irrelevant. You cannot apply decisive battle doctrine to an enemy who has decided your strongest islands aren't worth the cost of a frontal assault. You cannot mass your forces to repel a landing that never comes at the place you expected it. You cannot charge an enemy who has moved 580 miles up the coast. When the war ended in September 1945, the accounting of bypassed garrisons took weeks. At Rabaul, 69,000 troops and 20,000 civilians surrendered on September 6. General Imamura, in his dress uniform after 4 years of farming, came aboard HMS Glory. At Truk, the garrison that had been Japan's Gibraltar surrendered to American officers who were photographing rusted hulks in the lagoon as curiosities. At Wewak, fewer than 13,000 of 140,000 men were alive. In the bypassed outer marshals Wache, Maloelap, Mili, Jaluit, starvation, and disease had killed nearly twice as many of the 13,700-man combined garrison as Allied bombing had. The commanders who surrendered those garrisons were, almost universally, in worse physical condition than their men. They had been eating the same rations, contracting the same malaria, working the same fields. Some had been on their islands since 1942. They had watched American aircraft flying formations overhead, recognizing, long before the surrender came, that those aircraft were flying somewhere specific, somewhere that was not here, somewhere the war had decided to go instead. On Voce, the garrison commander who accepted the surrender order in September 1945 had been in the marshals for 3 years. He had waited for a battle that had happened 1,000 miles to his northwest, in waters he could not reach. His fortifications were intact. His men had kept their positions. There had simply been nothing to defend against and nothing to attack. No way to change that fact, and the war had ended without him. The principle that King and Nimitz and MacArthur had independently converged on from different directions, through different arguments, for different reasons, came down to this. The purpose of an offensive is not to kill every enemy soldier in your path. It is to destroy the enemy's ability to continue the war. A garrison that cannot be resupplied, cannot be reinforced, and cannot threaten your flanks or your supply lines is, for every practical purpose, already defeated. That the soldiers in it are still alive changes nothing about the strategic outcome. This was not an original idea. War Plan Orange, drafted by American planners as far back as 1897 and refined repeatedly through the 1930s, had always envisioned some form of island-by-island advance across the Pacific. Major Earl Ellis, a Marine officer who died under murky circumstances on the Japanese-mandated island of Palau in 1923, possibly a spy, possibly just a man whose drinking had caught up with him, had produced in 1921 a document titled Advanced Base Operations in Micronesia that outlined amphibious operations against Japanese-held islands with remarkable accuracy. His document was on file in the Navy Department when the war started. What the war produced was not a new concept, but a willingness to take the concept further than any peacetime planner had dared to skip, not just lightly held islands, but fortress-class bases holding six-digit troop strengths. To trust ultra-intelligence deeply enough to bet tens of thousands of lives on it. To move faster than Japanese reinforcement and fortification could respond. Japanese military thinking could not accommodate that idea because Japanese military thinking had been built around a different proposition that fighting spirit was itself a decisive military factor, that willingness to die was a capability that could offset material disadvantage, that the decisive battle was possible precisely because courage was not quantifiable on a factory floor. The Bushido Code, the Banzai Charge, the tradition of dying in place rather than surrendering all of it, rested on the premise that there existed something in the human soldier that production statistics could not address. Island hopping did not argue against that premise, it went around it. The fighting spirit at Rabaul, the willingness to die at Truk, the prepared defenses at Huache, none of it mattered, because the war that those men had prepared to fight decided not to show up. Spirit cannot be applied to an empty beach. Fortifications cannot be fired at an enemy who has gone somewhere else. Decisive battle cannot happen if the other side has decided not to have it with you. What Japan had built as a defense was, in the most precise sense, a collection of answers to questions America stopped asking. Every reinforced outer atoll in the Marshalls answered the question of what would happen if Americans attacked the outer atolls. Kwajalein answered a different question. Every gun at Rabaul answered the question of what would happen if the Americans came to Rabaul. Hollandia answered a different question. Japan spent the war's critical middle period answering questions that were no longer being posed, while the questions actually being asked, where is the soft point? Where is the gap? Where has the enemy left himself thin? Were being answered by ultra-intercepts, read in American intelligence rooms before Japanese headquarters had finished encoding them. The lesson that Saipan's fall taught Japan's senior military. The lesson Eiichiro Osawa expressed in 6 words, "We knew it was all over," was not that Japan had been outfought. Japan had fought hard at every engagement that happened. The lesson was that the most devastating thing an enemy can do to you is take away your ability to choose where the war happens. Once that choice belonged to American planners rather than Japanese ones, the strategic outcome was not in serious doubt. All that remained was the calendar, and the calendar moved according to American production schedules. The last American B-29 raid of the war flew from the Marianas on the 14th of August, 1945. The last atomic bomb mission had flown from Tinian's North Field 9 days before. From the moment Saipan was secured in July 1944 to Japan's surrender 14 months later, B-29 Seis, based in the Marianas, flew more than 28,000 sorties over the Japanese home islands. The men who built the Andes in September 1943 had known exactly what losing the Marianas would mean. They wrote it into the document that line between survival and defeat ran through those islands, because those islands were the last geographic barrier between American air bases and Japanese cities. What they could not account for, because their doctrine gave them no framework for it, was that the Americans would reach the Marianas not by fighting through every island in between, but by going around most of them. Their defensive preparations were thorough and, in the end, irrelevant, prepared for a battle that arrived from a direction the doctrine said Americans wouldn't come from. Moving on a timeline the doctrine said they couldn't maintain. Supported by logistics the doctrine said would collapse under their own weight across 3,000 miles of ocean. Japan built a wall. America found the gaps. And when there were no gaps, America built the logistics to go over the top. The soldiers left standing behind that wall, on islands the war decided weren't worth taking, are what the strategy cost, not the Americans, but the men it bypassed. That accounting, more than any battle, shows what island hopping actually was. Not a tactical innovation, but a judgment about what war is for, made by men who understood that killing soldiers is not the same thing as winning. Every one of those sorties launched from an island. Japan's September 1943 planning documents had placed explicitly inside the absolute national defense sphere the line, the guarantee, the concrete and choral promise that this far and no further. The men who wrote that document were not fools. They understood exactly what losing the Marianas would mean. They were right about what it would mean. They were wrong about every assumption underneath the prediction about how the Americans would advance, about where the decisive engagements would happen, about what their fortifications in the wrong places could accomplish against an enemy who had decided to go somewhere else. The absolute national defense sphere held, in theory, until the month it didn't. Then it was gone in 9 months, and 300,000 men were behind enemy lines on islands nobody was fighting over, and the B-29s were flying from Tinian, and the war had already been decided by a strategy Japan never fully believed was possible until it was too late to build an answer. Compartilhar conteúdo do projeto WW2 Nietzsche criado por você WW2 Avoid Styles. TXT 153. Linghust.